Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Appreciate you being here. So our agenda is first, we're going to give you an overview in slides about Pearl Mini, general overview of what Pearl Mini is and some of its specs. After that, we'll talk about Pearl Mini's place within the Pearl family of products, which is a pretty important thing to look at. Then we'll dive into some live demo. I'm going to be going through the administrator interface, kind of showing different sections of where we configure some of the different parts of a Pearl, some of the highlights, some of the most important things to pay attention to. So let's dive into the overview on Pearl Mini. What is Pearl Mini? Well, Pearl Mini is a dedicated hardware appliance for simplified video production, live streaming, recording, mixing, switching, all in a compact box designed to be extremely flexible. That's kind of what it is. So conceptually, it means we take what might have been traditionally a rack of additional pieces like a separate switcher, a separate recorder, a separate streaming encoder, splitters and scalers, kind of taking all of those pieces and simplifying it and condensing it down into a single all-in-one device, right? So we can bring in multiple inputs. We can mix and switch those multiple inputs, stream and record simultaneously. And we're going to get into more about what that looks like throughout the presentation today. One of the big advantages, of course, is that we can bring in a variety of different signals from video and audio. And then we also have a lot of flexibility in terms of our outputs. So this is a slide that really talks about a pretty common example of how we might see a Pearl Mini being used. We might bring an SDI signal in from something like a PTZ camera or a professional broadcast style camera. We might bring an HDMI feed in from a computer that's running a slide presentation or some other type of content. And we could even be bringing in an SRT-based IP stream from maybe, again, a PTZ camera or maybe even another Pearl. We can bring in analog audio over XLR from either Pro line level sources or with Mini, even with microphone level sources, because Mini can also provide phantom power and be configured to use a microphone level signal. So from video to audio inputs, we have a lot of flexibility. And then on the output side, Pearls offer a variety of different streaming protocols like RTMP, RTMPS, HLS, MPEG-, and SRT. We can use these or multiple of them at the same time to stream our content, to stream our production to whatever destination we want to be using. We also have an HDMI output on the back that we'll kind of get into some more detail on that we can use as a local confidence monitor and kind of a few other of these pieces. And while we're doing all these things, we can be recording to an SD card. One of the big things about the Pearl Mini as well is what we have built into the box itself. So it is a network-based appliance, like many hardware encoders are. So its main administrator interface, as we'll look at later, is over the network. But one of the things that makes the Pearl hardware encoders unique is that they have front screens built into them. In the case of Pearl Mini, it's a 7-inch touchscreen, which gives us confidence monitoring, the ability to do some switching, start-stop recording and streaming, all of that right on that built-in display. We don't necessarily have to have an external display or a network connection or another device connected over the network to do a lot of these functions. There's also a headphone jack that we can use to monitor audio for the confidence monitoring of what's shown on the display. There's menus for doing easy one-touch start and stop of multiple recording and streaming instances. And of course, we also have that removable SD card for storage. So there's a lot we can do once a Pearl is kind of built up and configured straight off the top of the box with that touchscreen, headphone jack, and other things. There's even some LED lights on the front, big bright lights to tell you whether it's streaming and recording. So the idea with Mini is to provide a small, compact device with a ton of flexibility to essentially become that live event workhorse for smaller scale productions. Heavy duty construction, it's metal, it's a metal chassis, it's not plastic. durable full-size connectors, right, with locking SDI if you're using that, full-size HDMI, things along those lines. And it is sized to be relatively portable. We do even sell an accessory hardshell case if you wanted to, put it into a Pelican style case and transport it around. You can easily do so with a Pearl Mini. But it also has some of the things that, again, stand out in the class for a hardware encoder of this size. And one of the areas that's really important is in the audio side. So I mentioned this already, but having the XLR and TRS analog audio jacks, this is a big deal when we're talking about professional grade equipment, where we have that XLR TRS flexibility. We have the flexibility of either line level inputs or microphone level inputs, including providing phantom power in some cases. So this means that we could have a professional audio mixer that may pre-exist in our studio space, just running the main out into Pearl Mini, easy enough. But in a smaller scale, maybe we're on the road and we need that portability, we could actually run two microphones directly off of Pearl Mini and power them off of Pearl Mini if they require it, without any other preamp or mixer involved. And so that gives us a lot of power and flexibility to put it into just about any situation. So from a video input perspective, we can connect all kinds of different things. We've tried to choose a selection of video inputs here that, again, speak to flexibility. So in total, there are 3 physical direct inputs with 2 HDMI and 1 SDI input. These are all capable of full HD capture. What this means is that SDI is fantastic for cameras, especially in situations where we need really long cable runs. SDI is spectacular for that. HDMI, not so good with long cable runs, but is very flexible for the types of devices that use HDMI, right? So it could be a computer, it could be a specialized piece of equipment, it could be a camera. I mean, everything uses HDMI these days. So that gives us a lot of flexibility with the 2 HDMI inputs. But then we also have that, more broadcast oriented, more professional grade or longer run oriented SDI for something like a camera. There's also the HDMI output, and this can be programmed and set to either function as a program out of our encoding, or it could be set to function more like a loop through from one of those video inputs. From the audio, and I touched on this already, we have the XLR TRS, which I've talked about. But in addition to that, we also have some other inputs. We have a 3.5 millimeter microphone input and stereo RCA kind of consumer line level inputs. We could actually be using those at the same time that we're using the XLR and TRS. And on top of that, the HDMI and SDI could all also be capturing embedded audio. So all told, you could be plugging in a lot of audio into the back of a Pearl Mini if you needed to. Storage is important. Pearl Mini doesn't have any built-in storage. We do need to use an SD card for this storage. Now, the good news is if we were using it purely as a streaming encoder and not as a recorder locally, then we don't need storage at all. But if we want to record locally, we do need to provide an SD card as that recording media. So there's no real specific guidelines here. It depends on what you need, but there's some rough things we recommend. Most people that are recording locally on a Pearl Mini want to record for a few hours, sometimes as much as 6 to 8 hours a day. And for that, mathematically speaking, you probably want to look at using a minimum of a 64 gig card. If it's maybe 2-3 hours a day, you could probably get away with a 16 or a 32 gig card. But, there's some limitations that happens there. In terms of cards we recommend, we don't officially endorse any specific brands, but what we do suggest is minimum speeds. We want those cards to be class 10 or U3 class cards because Pearl could be recording multiple simultaneous, potentially high bit rate recordings at the same time. We need to make sure that the media, the write speeds are going to be fast enough to keep up with what we're doing. So one of the ones in our testing that we do suggest, not an official endorsement, but one of the things we do suggest is the SanDisk Extreme and Extreme Pros. These are very good cards. They are a little more premium priced, but they're available pretty much anywhere. In our testing, their consistency for write speeds is fantastic, and they're easily available everywhere pretty much. So we do suggest those. Even if we don't want to leave the recordings on that SD card, we want to move them automatically somewhere else for larger storage or to ingest them into another platform, we can use the automatic file upload rules that Pearl has, AFU for short, to move files from that SD card to a remote destination like a file server or a USB drive. So that could be a NAS, like network attached storage, that's running an FTP server, an SFTP server, Samba server, Windows Share, that kind of thing, even to an AWS bucket if you want. So there's a few things we can do to move content automatically when it finishes recording. And so moving data can be important as a step because Pearl will operate as a looped recorder. If that storage fills, it will start to overwrite the oldest data in order to make new space and continue to record. It won't stop if it fills. So setting up something like the AFU settings to move files as they finish can be great to just make sure that there's a constant backup or constant flow for those files and we don't end up losing anything. Or just making sure that the card is like, 512 gigs so the buffer's large enough that you could record for several days before you have to worry about it. Another key component to the Pearl Mini is the custom layout designer. Now we're going to dive a lot deeper into this when we get into the actual hands-on portion, but the idea here is to be able to combine, crop, scale, size, position, use graphics overlays, text overlays, backgrounds in a very customizable, free-form way. So there's no templates based here. You can design basically whatever you want in a very easy to use click and drag style interface to make sure the content is what you want it to look like. To give you an idea, all of the layouts that you've been seeing in the webinar so far, with this side-by-side you have of me right now, with the colorful background, that's being generated by a Pearl. So it's a very simplistic one, but you can get fancier. And my producer just switched to a one-up of me. That switch was done on Pearl. Now we've done some other fancier things with some of our titles because a Pearl 2 is actually producing this and it has a few extra little gizmos, but at a basic level, you can do a very well-produced production with a Pearl Mini, built in with these custom layouts. And we're going to tinker with this so you guys can see exactly how we set those up. The other part that some people alluded to in there was integrating with content management systems. Pearl Mini is an excellent choice for lecture capture based on its feature set. And one of the things it has, and all Pearls have, is a direct integration with Kaltura and Panopto as content management systems. This deep integration means that, it can essentially become an automated box where you register it as an asset in Kaltura or Panopto, and you schedule all your events there and assign Pearl to those events. Pearl will download that schedule, automatically start and stop, and send the assets back to the platform, without any real human intervention automated after that point. In addition to that, Pearl, and this is really where Pearl Mini is so excellent for this, you can actually create an environment where you do ad hoc events for Kaltura or Panopto using that touchscreen on the Pearl. They can authenticate via the touchscreen, log in with their user credentials, and point to the folder that they want the recording, for example, or the live stream to go to. They have that control. They can do ad hoc straight from the touchscreen of Pearl Mini. And that can be, a fantastic piece in maybe a shared space, like a shared studio space where people are just going in and creating their content and going out. Another great integration we see quite frequently is controlling a Perl externally from third-party controllers. One of the easiest ways to do this is with Crestron controllers. Crestron, for those who are not familiar, make all kinds of stuff, but one of the things they're known for is very programmable control systems. In order to control the Perl there, you can absolutely use the APIs that Perl has. There's an HTTP-based API that you can customize basically whatever you want for Crestron or another system. But Crestron actually has an off-the-shelf, pre-built driver module for their systems specifically for Perl. And it's a great place to start to get you going and customize from there. So it'll give you the basics like start, stop, streaming, and recording and some switching functionality, but it's a great place to start and build from if you need to customize it. Without it being entirely custom from the ground up, you can kind of start with what they have off the shelf. And it's really great. And many customers do this, and it's fantastic. Another important part, since we are talking about, network-based appliances, is networking and security, obviously. Adding a Pearl Mini to just about any network is pretty easy, but different environments have different requirements. And we've tried to build in all the tools for pretty much any scenario. So from a basic level, it could just be plugging it into the network and getting an IP address assigned over DHCP, right? That's probably the bulk of people. But sometimes it's a static IP address. Sometimes for authentication, we need to integrate it with our domain. So we would use LDAP authentication to do so. People would log in with their domain credentials. We can fine tune the built-in roles to kind of control access a little bit. If we're in an environment where network level authentication is important, Pearls have 802.1x access control built into them so that they can authenticate using that method. You can enable HTTPS for SSL and kind of secure the web UI of Perl that way, including custom certificate support for some of these things. So from an IT perspective, the functionality of Pearl Mini and the Perl family is actually well above many other AV pieces of gear on the market. The front screen UI is also a big part, right? We talked about this a little bit already, but some of the functionality that we can do there is the switching. Once we create multiple of those custom layouts I mentioned, we can switch between them using the front touchscreen. We can also just do basic things like start-stop control. In addition to the main administrator web UI, we also have a more operator-oriented web UI, which is much more visual. And it's kind of like using the front touchscreen only remotely over the network. So it's actually pretty awesome to hand off to a day-to-day operator who's not necessarily going to be needing to touch administrative level functions. They just need to monitor things, start, stop, streaming and recording, do some switching, and they can do that on a device like an iPad or a tablet, since this particular interface, Epiphan Live, is designed for a mobile browser and a touchscreen style interface. But it's not an installable app. It runs in a browser, which means it's totally platform agnostic. You can use it on anything that has a web browser, essentially. So this is a tool that many customers love to use to just hand off to their day-to-day operators once the bulk of the configuration of Pearl Mini has been done. But what if we're not local? What if we want to do some of those functions a little more remotely? This plays a little bit into how we're running today's webinar as well. We have Epiphan Cloud to assist with that. Epiphan Cloud is a cloud-based system from Epiphan where you can basically pair all of your Perl devices, remotely monitor and remotely control them in the cloud over the internet. You don't have to be local to them. We've done some other content about Epiphan Cloud, so I would encourage you to go check that out. But my producer is accessing the Perl that's here in my home through Epiphan Cloud. The Perl I'm going to be using for my kind of actual configuration walkthrough is one I'm accessing remotely through Epiphan Cloud. So just to give you an idea, we can do quite a bit using cloud. Now, cloud does have kind of two different levels to it. There's a free plan. Anyone can sign up for this, pair their pearls, and use that for free. And it has a basic level of device management. You can do some monitoring of your individual pearls. You can do some start-stop of streaming and recording from the cloud. We also have pro plans that are paid, and they offer some more advanced tools like full administrative direct access, batch actions for monitoring larger fleets and stuff like that. So if you want to learn more, check out epiphan.com/cloud. It'll kind of break that down. If I'm honest, the majority of Pearl users are probably totally fine and are going to get everything they need out of even the free tier. So don't be scared away by the fact that there's two different tiers there. There's a lot you can do for under the free plan. Where does Pearl fit within the product family, right? Pearl is now a family of models. There are now 3 members of this family. They all follow the same general design philosophy. They're all designed to be versatile, reliable, easy to use, and professional quality devices. So what differentiates them? Although this is the starting point for all of them. Well, basically it's, small, medium, large if you want. Pearl Nano is the entry level to the family. It's kind of that perfect fit for, very minimal scenarios. Maybe you're putting it at the end of another production chain, or maybe you only need a single input and a single encoded output. Pearl Nano is fantastic for that. Pearl Mini, which we're talking about today, is the middle of the line. So in some ways, it's actually the most flexible because it has more inputs than Pearl Nano does. It has more simultaneous encoding out channels than Pearl Nano does. It has the larger touch screen, but it's not quite as big as Pearl 2 at the top end. It also introduces switching that Pearl Nano doesn't have. Where Pearl 2 is the big one, right? It basically takes Pearl Mini and doubles it for essentially. So Pearl Mini is ideal for that ultimate middle ground, right? For flexibility, performance, price, ease of use, usability, that kind of thing. So think of like a shared production space, like I mentioned earlier, where you might not have 5 cameras. You might only have 1 and a presentation, and you need to do some switching between those. And you need to be really easy for an operator to do that on their own. Pearl Mini is a great fit for that. And as we get into the live demo here, I'll kind of expand on that a little bit to clarify what I mean there in terms of the performance limitations of something like Pearl Mini. So the first thing I'm going to show, just to demonstrate, I'm connecting to one of my demo devices that's in our office. I'm at home. I'm using Epiphan Cloud for this. So just to give you a really quick tour of Cloud, in Cloud, I've paired it. I can get information about it. I can see the firmware it's using. I can see its storage status, its uptime, various different information. I can look at my encoding channels. I can look at different inputs that are connected. I can set custom alerts and so on. I can also stop recording when I'm looking at those channels, streaming. I can even create streaming destinations in the cloud, and they get pushed down to Pearl. But one of the things I can do here that's available on the pro account levels of Cloud is this button for remote login. When I do that, it allows me to directly connect to my Pearl Mini from the cloud, creating a secure tunnel directly to the Pearl Mini where it is in the office, in my demo studio. And I can access everything from an admin level exactly as though I was local to the device. So with this, it means I can fully control every aspect. And that's what we're looking at here. I'm just going to take a quick drink before we dive in there. But what we're looking at here is the full administrator interface of the Pearl Mini. This is the deepest level of access that exists for a Pearl Mini. And there's a bunch of different menus here. And I'm kind of highlight the most important ones and talk about how we use some of them. Starting from the bottom, the first page when we first log in is the main information page. This gives us a great summary of some of the things that are going on with our device. We can look at our firmware version. We can find out what our serial number is. It's reported in a couple of places. We can give it some device information like a custom name, description, things like that. This information can be found out when we're looking over the network. We also get a summary of our channels. Channels in the context of a Pearl are the encoders. These are our encoded outputs. And you can see that I have two of them here. And they're configured differently. One's configured for 1080p, one's configured for 720p. They have different bit rates. These are separate encoders doing different jobs simultaneously. So this is where I would get a quick summary of those. And the bulk of the configuration people will use most of the time on Pearls are with channels. So we're going to get to that. But I usually like to start from the bottom and work our way up, partially because it gets more interesting as we go up. So starting from the bottom, the main info page, place we land when we log in, useful, quick information overview. From there, the next section is firmware upgrades, right? So if we needed to do a firmware upgrade to a Pearl, we can check for updates. If it's an offline unit that isn't connected to the internet, we can do offline manual updates here. Maintenance page, pretty straightforward here. There's a few things we can turn on and off, like integration to cloud, logging. We can also create configuration presets here. These are essentially system profiles. So you can see I have the default one here. And then one of my colleagues during another demo created one called Sunday Services, right? But I can create whatever number of presets I want made up of different subcomponents of the system. So maybe I need one that has channels, but not passwords or networks and things like that, right? So you can fine tune this, name this. You can even download these presets once you've created them to upload them either back to the same Pearl if you needed to, or to another Pearl to clone the configuration across multiple devices. So you can do that by importing config presets. Maintenance is also where we'd find, if we need to wipe everything, start from scratch, we'd find a factory reset button. The media page is where we can manage and check on some of the uploaded content. I don't have anything uploaded here, but if we're using images for some of our layouts, I can upload them here or in the layout page, but this is where I could manage the library of files for that. There's some things we can do with external keyboards. So if we connect a USB keyboard to Pearl, there's actually a few things that we can do. We can use it to control the local console, which is a function of the HDMI output port, or to control the touchscreen on Pearl. So there's a few different things that we can do here to, instead of purely using the touchscreen or something like that, we can use it to do some of the controls within there. And that could be really helpful for an integration with, say, Panopto, where we want people to create ad hoc events using the front touchscreen, but using a keyboard, physical keyboard, instead of a touchscreen keyboard, right? Some people just prefer it that way. So there's some ways we can configure that. On the touchscreen section, again, the touchscreen by default can do lots of things, but if we need to control or modify what's allowed or not allowed on the touchscreen, even turning it off entirely, we can do that here. We can set a timeout, we can set a PIN code, we can decide that you see no previews or no system status, no control over the network settings from there, just seeing things and controlling start stop, that kind of thing. We can set it up so that it's essentially kiosked to only land when you boot it up on the content management system page. Again, if you're integrated with Kaltura or Panopto, it means only the UI elements that allow people to log in and create ad hoc events for the CMS are there. So there's a few different ways we can fine tune what the behavior of the front touchscreen is. The security section actually has a lot of things that I mentioned. For example, built into Pearls, there are 3 different accounts: administrator, operator, and viewer. These are pretty logical by name. Administrator is everything. Operator is routine operations, but really can't change deeper settings. And you can view streams and recordings, and that's all. You can set separate passwords for each of these. However, if we have like 10 different people that are going to use it, instead of them all sharing one password, that's where we might, if we have a domain environment, we might integrate Perl over LDAP so that people log in using their domain credentials, and then based on domain group policy, they would be binned into one of those three categories. So this can be very useful for the people who use domains. Obviously, this is something that only the domain admins should be touching, but it is possible there that allows you to do. The other thing we can do is if maybe we're not using that and we want to grant our operators, that kind of middle control tier, a few more different benefits, right? We can kind of fine tune some additional privileges to the operator if we want. So maybe they do need network configuration access, right? We can grant them that and to play around with different things. Okay, you can fine tune that a little bit. The other thing from a security perspective is HTTPS. This is something that's becoming a very common mandate for many people on their networks and their organizations, where anything with a web browser-based UI needs to use HTTPS to make sure that that connection is secure. So by default, Perl uses HTTP, but you can enable HTTPS and set up custom ports if you need to, but the kind of defaults for those protocols are there. And we do have some built-in certificates for this, but if you want to load your own certificates, you can. There's a way to upload your own certificates, private keys, and so on if you need to. And again, this is something that's becoming a more common security mandate in many organizations. If you want to kind of manage some different certificates, again, you can do that here. You can see the ones that are built in and so on. As another layer, if your IT guys really love to just do IP-based filtering, you can create allow and deny lists based on IP addresses as well. The next section is time and date. Time and date is pretty self-explanatory. It's probably one of the least interesting things. But by default, it's going to sync using online NTP servers to synchronize its clock online. But you can set it manually. Maybe you can't. Maybe, again, it's an offline unit that doesn't reach to the internet. You can set it manually or change the NTP servers. And we also support PTP-v1 as a time protocol. So there's a few things you can play with there. The network settings, again, nothing too complicated here for the most part. You can use DHCP or a static address. If you're using a static address, then, generally we're going to be setting an IP address, a network mask, a gateway, and a DNS server. And Perl can also support, under DHCP, using DHCP option 81, which is fully qualified domain. So if we need to basically tell our DHCP server, a DNS name under that protocol that Perl's going to use, we can enter that there. So if people use DNSs locally as opposed to IPs, that can help keep things tracked. The other part here is if we're under the mandate for security reasons to use 8021X, we can also enable that here. For those not familiar, 8021X is essentially a hardware-based network authentication tool. The organizations that deploy it, typically it's a scenario where, you cannot pass if you do not authenticate. Like, you can physically plug into the network, but you are blocked from any traffic until you authenticate over this. And so there's a variety of methods people might use with different authentication methods and so on. Perl supports all of that. And again, custom keys, that sort of thing if you need it. By default, Perl does use MDNS, or some people might know it as Apple's Bonjour service, but essentially it has an MDNS name of the serial number.local automatically. This is on by default, but you can turn it off if that's a protocol that your IT guys don't want. You can turn that off. And then we've also recently added actual full dynamic DNS. With full dynamic DNS, it means we could use different providers, like DynDNS is a very common and popular one, or custom service if you need. The advantage here for anyone who's not used DynDNS before, for example, is that you might have port forwarding and things like that set up, and you want people to reach the Pearl, through that, but the IP address can change. So using dynamic DNS means that even if the IP address changes, you through one of those services, you're setting a DNS name, and the IP address in that will get updated automatically, right? So this can help us do that. Not everyone's going to use this, but this can be a fantastic tool for setting things up. And of course, the settings do change depending on the service that we're using. I've used DynDNS in the past to custom host servers and stuff like that from my home. So Pearl can be a great tool for that. Another thing we very recently added were network diagnostics. And there's a few different pieces in here that we can play with. The first one is connectivity status generally. We can run this and it's going to give us a whole bunch of checks, right? So it's going to tell us what our connection speed is. Again, it's in this case gigabit Ethernet, as it should be. But if it wasn't, or there was a problem and we were only getting like 10/100, for example, it would tell us. It'll tell us whether 802.1x is there. It's going to tell us, local IPs and DNS servers and so on. It'll tell us whether or not a captive portal, like when you go to a hotel and there's a web browser that you have to authenticate with before you can get on the internet, right? Pearl doesn't have a way of circumventing that. And so we need to know if one exists. And this would fail if one did. Connection to the internet. Can we ping the internet? Yes or no? Are some of these things working? Can we reach Epiphan Cloud and so on? These are all super helpful ways, especially if we're traveling with the device, we're connecting it to a new network that we might not have direct control over, and we need to get some quick information about network status. Running this tool can give us that. We can also do pings, we can do trace routes, and then we also added a bandwidth test. So this pings a server to test upload and download speeds, from the Pearl. Again, as part of network diagnostics, let's get an idea of what our bandwidth is. Especially if we're doing live streaming, we probably want to know what our upload speed is to get a sense of how much can we actually do. This can help give us an indication. Like any speed test, speeds always vary a little bit. There's peaks and valleys, so we never want to run at 100%. But, I know now that I have 30 meg, to basically play with, but not at 100%. I would probably only go at about 75% of that to be safe at max, right? So again, I can do some math to say, okay, I could probably stream out a total of 20 meg pretty safely on that connection, right? So anyway, there's a few tools in here that can be very helpful. Even again, DNS names. If we're having DNS issues, we can help troubleshoot that with these tools. Moving on from there, there's kind of pieces here like UPnP. This is something that if we want to share live streams or recorded files on the local network using UPnP, Universal Plug and Play, so it's an auto discovery ability. This is a great thing. You can give Pearl a name and then say what you want to share over that. And that's going to say allow a smart TV to auto discover the stream locally from Pearl and connect to it, right? So there's some use cases where UPnP can be very useful. External USB drives. There's a few different behavior modes we can use here, and maybe we'll touch on that a little bit later. I can see already there's something I'm going to have to change before I dive too deep into that. The SD card, it's really not a whole lot to do here other than when we first get a Pearl and we first install our SD card, we are going to need to format it. Pearl uses a Linux file system for storage, so we need to format the SD card into a Linux file system. So when we first install an SD card, we'll want to do a quick format just to make sure that we can use the card. CMS. This is where we would configure something for Panopto or Kaltura. For the rest of this demo, I'm actually going to turn this off because it takes over some other settings that might be important. But this is where we would configure those, right? We would give the service URL and registration keys and all the various different pieces we might need to authenticate with those instances. But for now, I'm going to turn that off. And again, if you're a Panopto or a Kaltura user, a lot of that stuff is going to make sense to you when you look at it. So I'm not going to go into too much detail today on exactly what all of those pieces mean. Epiphan Cloud, as you saw, I can pair a device to Epiphan Cloud. Each Pearl has a unique ID that can change. And basically, I'd take that ID, I'd add a new device in my cloud account with that ID and give it a name. I'm already paired, but I could unpair it here as well if I wanted to, but then I'd lose access, so I'm not going to do that. And then one of the areas that gets taken over by CMS is automatic file upload. So I mentioned during kind of the overview that AFU, for short, is where we can use kind of more generic file server type protocols like FTP, SFTP, and so on to automatically move files from Perl storage to an external storage destination. That could be a USB drive that's directly connected, or it could be one of these network-based protocols like FTP, rsync, CIFS, which is Windows Share, Samba servers, SFTP, Amazon S3, that kind of thing, WebDAV. So it's the kind of thing where, if you're running a server in one of these, whether that's locally on your network or potentially even in the cloud that supports these protocols, you can have Perl move files to that destination automatically based on some rules you can set up. So some of those rules might be, we're setting them up on a schedule, right? You could say, I want to upload files between such and such time, or just move them as they finish, right? We can create these different pieces here. We can create subfolders for the device. Maybe multiple Perls are going to the same server. We can set up different channels for subfolders. We can remove them after they've been successfully uploaded to make sure that our storage is clear all the time. Or at least mark them as being downloaded so that if someone comes back manually, they don't download files that have already been moved, that kind of thing. And of course, the usual authentication there. And again, depending on the protocol, there's some different options to load. The events page is something that is only used when we're using CMS integration, but this is where we would see the list of scheduled events that Perl has downloaded from the content management system, the schedule, essentially. It'll show upcoming schedule and past schedule on this page when it's configured. There's a few things that we can do here on the HDMI output. We can select which channel we want to show here. For example, our first encoding channel, or maybe our second encoding channel, or even use one of the inputs as a loop through. We can enable audio if we want to go out there as well. Maybe we're using an external display that has speakers and that's where we're going to monitor audio. Or maybe we just want to display a meter externally. We can do that as well. If we're displaying it as maybe a confidence monitor for the on-camera talent, oftentimes that means we want to mirror it so that they can better understand their lefts and rights. So we have that option as well, right? Again, we can kind of choose how we want to configure this, including the option for local console. So coming back to the keyboard settings, local console would allow us to connect a keyboard and mouse over USB, enable local console in the HDMI output, and then you would have full administrator access locally without having to do it over the network. And some people really enjoy doing that. They're going to do it manually directly to the system, but they need full administrator. They don't want to bring a laptop or something connected to the same network. They just want it really quick and simple as a local console. We have that ability as well. Pearl, it has that wedge shape to it. Pearl Mini has that wedge shaped to it, with the slimmer edge normally being towards you, normal. But if you need to flip it because you're mounting it, Pearl Mini actually has 75 by 75 VESA mount holes on the back, so you could bolt it to something. You could flip it as well if the orientation, as Stephen was pointing out, made more sense to have the cables hanging down because you're mounting it to like a wall or something. You can flip that screen so that it flips 180. All right, so I think we're up to inputs. The inputs part is pretty straightforward. Inputs are all of the different inputs here, including things like USB devices. The USB 3 ports we can use for UVC or UAC based devices, video and audio devices, essentially. So, if, for example, we didn't want to use an SDI based camera and we were going to use a webcam instead, we can use that over USB on Pearl Mini. So, there's two USB ports on the back of Pearl Mini that we can use for this. They could both be used at the same time for either video or audio devices. Just to give you an idea, you can just barely see it in frame here on camera, but I use a Blue Yeti Nano in my home here for the audio that you guys are hearing from me. That is directly connected over USB to my Pearl Mini. So it's a USB input that I can just run a very small localized setup using a USB microphone. But it could be, like I say, a USB camera as well. So there's some flexibility there. SDI audio, HDMI audio, when we have these inputs running, as you can see here from one of my sources, we can get audio levels coming in over these digital inputs. If we're having synchronization issues we need to adjust, we can adjust the audio delay coming from these inputs. But there's not a whole lot to configure for digital audio. Once we start getting into the analog audio, that's where we can get a little more creative, right? We can adjust gain. On the RCA and 3.5 mil, we can use both or one or the other. We can adjust the gain, we can adjust the delays, and of course we'd see the levels again as well. When we get into XLR TRS, very similar, but we can use them as a stereo pair, or we can use them as independent monos, as we mentioned before. We can enable phantom power, and we can adjust the gain levels to be appropriate to whatever the source, whether it's line level down here or mic level up here, right? So we can play with those. And again, there's different ways that we can enable that. On the inputs wise, from video, aside from USB, we have the SDI input, which I don't currently have connected, but it gives us a great example of some of the ways we can fine tune what we do with these. They're all digital inputs. So again, there's not a lot to configure. They're all pretty much auto detect, and they would tell us what they're detecting. In this case, there's nothing plugged in, so it's giving me this very boring no signal picture. But one of the settings I have here is actually for a no signal picture. This means that I can customize, I can upload to that media page that we looked at earlier. I can upload a graphic to Pearl and use that graphic as a custom no signal picture instead of this built-in boring one. So it's one of those things where maybe it's for branding purposes or just because I want it to look better, but I can actually have a different no signal picture set per input. My HDMI inputs are both connected. So my first one is from my camera that's in that demo studio. And you can see here it's detecting, it's 1080, it's 60 hertz coming in from that camera. And that's a Canon G20 camcorder style camera. Pretty common, pretty standard signal coming out of just about any camera over HDMI. And I get a snapshot preview instead of that no signal picture since that's live. This is live, and the Mini that I'm controlling is actually the one you see here sitting on the desk in that studio space, and also my demonstration Pearl 2 sitting next to it. So that's that one. The other one I have coming in is also, this is coming from a PC that's sitting in that room, and it's also coming in at 1080 at 60 hertz. So let's dive into channels. Each channel, as I just mentioned, is independent of each other, which means each channel has its own set of custom layouts where we can create different scenarios. Each channel has its own encoding settings. This one in particular is set up for 1080p at 30 frames per second at 6 megabit as a live stream, for example. And I can create a streamed output from this to something like YouTube. It would look something like this. I'm going to delete that stream key, although I'm sure it's a long dead stream key. But we can do this. Now, this is where I come back to where I said earlier for Alex saying, we can think about outputs in different ways. We can think about outputs as separate encodes, but we can also think about outputs as separate streams of the same content. So within this encoding channel, I have it set for 1080p, 30 frames per second at 6 megabit. If I want that same content to be streamed to multiple destinations at the same time, let's say YouTube and Facebook, pretty popular scenario, I can create multiple streaming destinations within this one encoder, provided that I have enough bandwidth, because if I'm sending them both out at the same time, one to YouTube, one to Facebook, I'm sending 6 megabit to each, so that's now 12 megabit. So I have to pay attention to my bandwidth limits, but I don't have to create a separate encoder as long as the platforms I'm trying to reach can use the same encoding settings, right? So that's why I say there's kind of two different ways to look at outputs. Now, if I do have to use two different encoding methods, that's where I would do it in two separate channels, right? This channel is set up for 720p at 1.5 megabit at 30 frames per second and can have its own streaming destinations I can configure. Similarly, recording wise, right? Maybe this first channel is my local recording, and so it's going to be at 1080 at a really high bit rate to make sure my recording is good quality, but I need to actually stream out at 720 at a much lower bit rate because I just don't have the bandwidth. I would create separate channels to do that. So, long story short, I can multi-stream from a single encoder as long as the destinations can all share the same encoding settings. And many of the most popular streaming destinations like Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Vimeo, places like that, typically can all use the same encoding settings. Recording wise, in this channel, it's going to follow whatever my encoding settings are. And I can set up some triggers to break the files into chunks and also to set my container. So it's going to be compressed in H.264, but I can set my container type to be AVI, MPEG-TS, MOV, or MP4. You'll notice here that I have installed a SD card that is basically smaller than the file size chunk that had attempted to be set previously, so I'm getting a warning. These chunks are based and time limits are basically on a whichever comes first, right? So I can set these for very high values if the storage can hold it, right? But I only have a 16 gig card installed here. I can't fit a 16 gig file onto that card. So mathematically speaking, in order to set it so that I can create at least two files and start recording another, just do some math and go, okay, I can't set it for more than 4 gig just in case I loop back too soon, right? So there's some warnings that automatically happens when you try and do that. You can see here that there's a bunch of different recordings from different demos that be done on this unit that are sitting on this unit. Just random things here. I can delete them. I can rename them. I can download them. I can even play them in a browser tab just using an HTML5 player. So without even downloading it, if I just wanted to quickly verify what do these look like, I can click the play button and it can open it in another tab and it would play that file. This is going to look weird in the crop for my producer, just to throw something at him just for fun. But we can do that. It's not that hard. So that's where we can manage files. And again, my other channel has its own encoding settings and can have its own set of files doing its own thing. So that's kind of how we can control some of that stuff. The other thing that we can do here is create a recorder. This is kind of a unique feature to Pearls and is quite honestly not a feature that the vast majority of Pearl users will use. The recorder section allows us to create a multi-track recorder. And what this does is we can choose a selection of our encoding channels to participate in this multi-track recorder. And when I start that, it means that I'm going to record a single file with multiple video tracks and audio tracks depending on the number of encoding channels I have configured. So in this scenario, I have two. If I started this, I would have a single file with two separate video tracks inside of it and different audio tracks. This can be great for creating a file that has, these kind of two different independent encoded things with a synchronized start and stop. The drawback is that multi-track video files is kind of a weird thing. It's not actually really a common usage. So you couldn't just take this multi-track file and drop it into something like Adobe Premiere and edit it, because it will only see the first video track. It won't understand the multiple tracks. And same is true with many video players, with the exception of something like VLC, where VLC understands a multi-track file. And when you play it back in VLC, it'll actually open up multiple windows, one for each track, right? So we have many customers, typically more with Pearl 2, to be fair, who use Pearl to record the video outputs from something like a flight simulator. And all the instrumentation is being captured and recorded on Pearl. They'll use a multi-track file to record all of that into a single file, so that when they go to play it back during debrief, everything is in sync. Everything just pops up, in different windows and for playback. But it's not so much like, someone who's producing a live event and is going to be doing post-production on the recordings. It's not really a usage for them. So it exists. It's something you can use. But the only reason to use this recorder's part is to create a multi-track file, really. If you're not going to use that multi-track nature of it, it's generally going to be better to save yourself some work to just have each channel record itself, basically, and use the individual files just for your post-production headaches to be saved, essentially. So again, kind of going through here, each channel we can configure those streams. We kind of looked at that already. The stream protocols we can support, RTMP, also means RTMP-S, as you saw. Basically, the only difference is the URL. We can also create MPEG-TS, RTP, UDP push. So this is multicast on a local area network. We can create that. And there's a few different variations of that, depending on how you want to use multicast. You can create an SRT push. You can create an HLS push, a dash push. So there's different things here, different protocols, depending on the CDN or the streaming server you're trying to reach. Many of them are starting to use HLS. For example, YouTube now offers HLS as an option instead of RTMP. You could totally use that with Pearl just by using those credentials. Akamai has also started using HLS for the most part. Dash is something that's picking up popularity. And of course, SRT is one we talk about here at Epiphan all the time. And so, of course, Pearls use it both as an input and as an output. So we can configure it as an output here using Caller or Rendezvous, something like that. In fact, this is, I know some people have asked, because they always ask, how do we do these webinars? So what I'm actually doing is my Pearl that's here in my home is sending an SRT stream to a Pearl that's in our studio in the office where I am not. And our producer has remote access of those pieces. And he's able to mix in other elements into the production at that kind of Pearl 2 hub in the office. I'm sending SRT to there. That Pearl is sending RTMP to Crowdcast where you guys are viewing me. We use this system because it also means that if I had a co-host, they would also be sending SRT into that studio Pearl. We'd be mixed together at that stage and then sent out as a combined mix over RTMP to Crowdcast. So that's one of the reasons we do this, is that we've all been working from home at this point for, I don't even know, I'm losing track. I just know it's been well over a year now. So it's, this is how we've been doing remote production, and it is fantastic. The advantage is that although I am using a Pearl Mini in my home at the moment, I could be using a Pearl Nano and do exactly the same job that I'm doing right now for this webinar. So that's a little bit about that. The layouts. This is the only one I haven't really dive deep into because it's best for last, right? Showmanship and all that. The custom layouts is also where Pearl Mini and Pearl 2 switching ability comes into play. Unlike maybe some more traditional broadcast infrastructure where switching is based on literal inputs, Pearl is not. Pearl switching is based on layouts that you create, whatever those layouts are made up of. So it can functionally be the same thing, right? Create a layout for each input, and then you're switching switching inputs, right? But it can be more than that as well. But thinking about it a little differently can be helpful. So within these layouts, for example, again, this is all demo, so this has all been used before, but I'm going to use this first one as a demonstration. This is using two different inputs, side by side, and even some custom text that was laid out there, and even using cropping. So when I'm adding these elements, it's all click and drag, right? To choose the size and the positioning of these different pieces. It's really easy to use. I can then save the layout. So that's one that was already there. I'm going to create one from scratch if one of these isn't already blank. So we're going to create a new one from scratch. So we create a new layout from scratch. I get this blank canvas, right? We call it a layout, but for anyone who's familiar with using software like OBS, you can think of this like scenes. It's an equivalent idea. You create a scene, and then we add elements to that scene, right? We call them items. Those items can be a video source, an image like a JPEG or a PNG image, or the custom text tool that's built into Pearl. In this case, I'm going to create or add one of my inputs. Actually use my camera input for this. So this is my camera input that's in that studio, and I can stretch it to be full screen. I can move it around to, choose the size and the positioning of, what I want it to be. I really want to upload a graphic here, so I'm just going to quickly find an image. Here's one. This is a fun one. This is one I was joking around with a little while ago with some of my colleagues. So I'm going to add a new item as a picture. Now, if I already had the picture uploaded, I could select it from the drop-down box. I don't, so I'm going to drag and drop it from my Windows Explorer window that I just opened in the background and drop it into my Pearl. It uploaded it to Pearl in the background, and I now have that image asset in Pearl, and I can choose the size and positioning of what I want it to be. Well, now I just added it over top of my video input, so that's no good. I wanted this to be my background. Well, luckily, the orientation or the layers are logical to click and drag also within Pearl. So I just move it to the bottom layer, and now my video is on top. And I can just keep playing with stuff there. Maybe I'm going to add custom text that's just showing the date and timestamp along the bottom, right? I'm going to remove some of those elements. I want just the date and time. I can position that and choose where I want it to be. I don't want it to have a background. I want it to be transparent. Again, I can play with this, and I can add custom text to kind of give it whatever I want it to be. Right? It's not difficult to play with this. Right? It's pretty straightforward. So again, this is all built into Pearl. Now, of course, I can continue to add other images if I want. Right? I'm going to click and drag this one. This is going to be a shameless plug a little bit for the Ride for Dad, which is a charitable fundraising effort that I participate in, Motorcycle Ride for Dad. But I can add something like this, which is great as a watermark overlay that I could put down here in the corner, right? It's that simple. It's that easy. So I can then choose what audio inputs I want to attach to this, right? I have only the HDMI input connected from my camera, so I would choose that. And that's pretty much all I need in this layout. Now, these other layouts have already been created. So if I wanted to switch between, say, this one, the previous one, and this one, all I have to do is click the radio button. That's all I have to do as an administrator. But when I go into Epiphan Live as a dashboard, basically I can look at things a little differently, right? I can go into my switching interface and I'm going to see thumbnails of my different layouts along the bottom. I can queue them up and I can switch to them when I'm ready to go live, and I can move back and forth between them. Epiphan Live is going to give me a more visual representation of that switching interface, much like the front touchscreen does, right? So with this, it's a situation where, again, I've built my layouts. I don't need to edit or change them again. I just need to switch between them. I can do that. I can do that here very, very easily. And then, of course, coming back to that top dashboard, I can stop recording here. I can, monitor my pieces and see all these different elements, right there in the Epiphan Live dashboard, for the day-to-day stuff instead of the full administrative layer. Again, and the operators can't change the layouts, right? They can just kind of monitor things and start and stop things. So this gives us a lot of options on how we can minimize what they can control and focus on just the routine operations of start, stop, monitoring, switching. Thank you all so much for being here today. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for hanging out with me. We will see you in the next webinar. We have some more interesting stuff coming up for you. And goodbye for now.